So it is also not yet fully understood why antibiotics and dysbiosis affect metabolism. What we do know is that microbes are directly responsible for certain aspects of our nutrition, including vitamins extracted or produced, as well as how efficiently calories are used. They even are involved in signaling pathways responsible for fat storage. Antibiotics have been used in the food industry for quite a while now to increase growth of animals such as cows and chickens. No one ever knew why it worked. It just has been known to be true that if you consistently feed cows antibiotics, they get bigger than the cows that have not been given antibiotics. So in animal husbandry, cows and chickens and pigs are given low-level antibiotics on a regular basis to make it possible to feed them less while they grow more. Now in labs, we've also seen this in mice, as I've already discussed in the previous lecture. And we've seen that simply by transferring gut microbes from obese mice, you can make a lean mouse obese, showing that indeed the relationship between antibiotics and obesity is related to microbial communities. Some research suggests that though caloric diets certainly contribute to the global obesity epidemic, and again, I can remind you that a global epidemic is a pandemic, the amount of calories consumed worldwide is not enough in and of itself to explain the degree or frequency of obesity. More and more evidence is mounting that dysbiosis, partially from an overuse of antibiotics, contributes to the obesity epidemic or obesity pandemic. So one of the ways microbes have been shown to affect weight is not related to digestion of the food itself, but rather to the amount eaten. Microbes seem to affect an animal's ability to feel satiated, so that dysbiosis in the gut can cause animals to eat more than they would otherwise. In other words, when given the microbiome of obese mice, lean mice begin to eat more than they did prior to the transfer. And they do not become, and they sometimes do not become that obese if their food intake is restricted. So that means that, sometimes these mice are becoming obese simply because they are storing fat differently. But sometimes they become obese because of the behavioral changes in the mice. And so that brings us to microbes and mood. Not only have microbes been shown to affect feelings of satiety, or the ability to feel satiated after eating, but they are now being implicated in several other mood disorders, such as anxiety, depression, autism, alcohol addiction, and insomnia. So I want to come back to this slide that I brought up at the very beginning of the first microbiome lecture and read it in more detail. Gut microbes, so the title of this paper is The Gut Microbiome in the Brain. And this is an excerpt from the abstract of this peer-reviewed research paper. Gut microbes shape the architecture of sleep and stress reactivity of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. They influence memory, mood, and cognition, and are clinically and therapeutically relevant to a range of disorders, including alcoholism, chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, and restless leg syndrome. Okay, so let me break this down a little bit. Gut microbes shape the architecture of sleep and stress reactivity of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is the part of your neuroendocrine system that is responsible for processing stress. Okay? It's sometimes called the HPA axis. It is your stress response system. The hypothalamus is in your brain. It receives signals from your environment and sends a signal to your pituitary gland, which is also in your brain, which sends a signal to your adrenal glands, which release in response to that stress hormones like cortisol, among other things, adrenaline, things like that. So this article is saying that sleep and stress can be affected by gut microbes because the gut microbes are influencing the way your stress response system behaves, the HPA axis behaves. So these microbes can influence memory, mood, and cognition because they are affecting cortisol and adrenaline and a bunch of other hormones that are controlled by the HPA axis. Okay. And so they're becoming clinically relevant to disorders like alcoholism, chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, and restless leg syndrome. So this sounds way out there, right? The idea that the microbes in your gut could be affecting your brain so profoundly. But it turns out we know, actually, we've identified some of the biological pathways by which this happens. So how can microbes affect your mood in this way? Well, for one thing, some immune system abnormalities contribute to certain neurological disorders. And we've already talked about how microbes affect your immune system. So when you have chronic inflammation in a neurological pathway, it affects the way that neurological pathway works. So that's one way. Your microbes can actually affect your nervous system by affecting inflammation in your nervous system. Another way is through stimulating the intestinal endocrine system. So some microbes can stimulate these endocrine cells in your gut. So an endocrine cell is a cell that releases hormones. And your intestines are filled with endocrine cells. Most of these endocrine cells are responsible for getting ready to eat or feeling full. Okay, so these are hormones that affect feelings of hunger, feelings of satiety. They also do other things, like they communicate with other aspects of your digestive system, like your gallbladder, your liver, your pancreas. So they communicate with these other organs in your body that are involved in digestion and nutrient absorption. Okay? But feelings of satiety are certainly a part of this. And they can travel to the brain. So another way that your gut microbiomes can affect your mood and your brain is by producing hormone and neurotransmitter mimics and other mind-altering metabolites. So it turns out that a lot of microbes can produce molecules that are so similar to your own hormones and neurotransmitters that they behave the same way in your body as your own hormones and neurotransmitters were. So this is like, mood and the molecules of emotions that your brain typically produces are now being produced by the microbes in your gut. The vagus nerve traverses our bodies from our brains to all of our organs, and it's heavily wrapped around the intestines as well as the other viscera. Microbes can stimulate the vagus nerve as well. So the job of the vagus nerve is to communicate between the organs and the brain. Okay? And microbes can stimulate this vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve, I want to talk about it just a little bit just to drive this point home. The vagus nerve travels from the brain to all the viscera, all the internal organs. It sends regulating signals to those organs, and it also senses the condition of those organs and relays information about their state back to the brain. Among other things, the vagus nerve controls heart and intestinal function. It connects many types of muscles in the body. The vagus nerve explains why, if your ear is tickled, many people cough. And it also explains why, because there's these vagus neurons that connect these seemingly unrelated muscle reflexes. And the vagus nerve also explains why certain types of intestinal stimulation by pathogens causes muscle reflexes that induce vomiting. Okay? So you get these irritating signals from your gut through your vagus nerve to your brain, and your brain then sends the signal that these muscles should contract, which results in puking. Activation of the vagus nerve typically leads to a reduction in heart rate, a reduction in blood pressure, or both. This occurs commonly in the setting of gastrointestinal illness or in response to pain, actually. So when the circulatory, the vagus nerve can be activated by pain in the body, which causes a drop in blood pressure or a drop in heart rate, but also emotional stress, because it turns out our brains process emotional pain and physical pain very similarly. So emotional pain ends up having the same effects on the vagus nerve in many cases. So when these circulatory changes are great enough, vagus nerve stimulation can result in fainting. So if you experience a lot of pain or a lot of emotional stress, some people can faint. And that's because of the drop in heart rate and blood pressure. There's not enough oxygen getting to the brain. Extreme emotional stress can cause excessive activation of the vagus nerve, and so can also lead to fainting due to heart rate and blood pressure drop. These changes in body conditions can lead to a general sense of malaise when they're more mild. It's not like you're always fainting in response to vagus nerve stimulation. When the stimulation is more mild, you just get this general sense of malaise. So you get that feeling when you're sick sometimes. Sometimes, you're sick and you know you're sick, but you can't identify a specific place where something hurts. You just have this general sense of malaise. And that's because we don't have pain receptors in a lot of these organs, but they do have nervous system, communication with the brain all the same. It's just not conscious for us, but we can get this kind of general uncomfortable feeling. And you get that when you're feeling emotionally distressed as well. So you can see that the vagus nerve connects two systems we tend to classify separately, the psychological emotional and the physical. It also provides a link between the autonomic nervous system and the central nervous system. All right, so the vagus nerve, or I should say, the peripheral nervous system, not the central nervous system. So there's a link between the autonomic nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, which is the nervous system that extends out to your extremities, to your arms, your legs, the parts of your body outside your brain. So vagus and the autonomic nervous system is everything that's automated that you don't have to think about. I'm not sure, so your autonomic nervous system, so sort of like heart rate, blood pressure, those aspects of the nervous system that you don't think about but that work without your conscious control, that's the autonomic nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is under your conscious control, and the vagus nerve connects these two. So vagus nerve stimulation, and just to drive home this connection between the psychological, emotional aspect of the vagus nerve and the more what we consider traditional biological aspect of the vagus nerve. So vagus nerve stimulation therapy involves a pacemaker-like device that's implanted in the chest. And this kind of therapy has been used since 1997 to control seizures in epilepsy patients. And it has also recently been approved for treating drug-resistant cases of clinical depression. So the same vagus nerve stimulation therapy can be used to treat seizures as well as depression. So just to go back to this list you will need to know about how microbes affect mood. So microbes can affect, or not just mood, but also the brain and how the brain functions. So microbes can affect the brain through their effects on the immune system and inflammation, because a lot of neurological disorders are related to nervous system inflammation. Microbes can stimulate the endocrine cells of the intestine. Those are cells in the intestine that release hormones. Microbes can produce hormone and neurotransmitter mimics, and microbes can stimulate the vagus nerve, which is the part of the nervous system that communicates between the brain and all of the organs of the body. This video link I'm also going to put in the course website, and this is about basically what you just heard about how microbes affect the brain. It's a TEDx talk. And in this talk, you will learn about the research, some of the research that's been done that has helped us understand how microbes affect the brain. So the woman who gives this talk, she's involved in research at Caltech with mice. And what they do is they raise germ-free mice that have no microbiome. Then they infect these mice with specific species of bacteria and see what it does to the brain. So there are other microbiomes in the body outside of the gut. Like the gut is arguably the most important, and it's also the best researched, because that's where most of your microbes live. Most of your microbes are in your gut. But it seems microbial communities could be implicated, at least partially, in skin conditions such as atopic dermatitis or psoriasis. These are conditions which, like asthma and allergies, have been on the rise in recent decades. So we're finding more and more that skin microbiomes are different in people who suffer from atopic dermatitis and psoriasis relative to people who don't suffer. There is a mouth microbiome that's important. Balance of the mouth could be important to preventing dental caries and gingivitis. You may have thought your respiratory tract and your lungs were sterile. That is not true. There is a respiratory microbiome. And there's been a lot of research now into microbes of the respiratory tract to start describing what should and what shouldn't be there, and how respiratory diseases might be related to respiratory dysbiosis. Vaginal microbiome we've already talked about in this course. So we've talked about how vaginal health is dependent upon the mutualists lactobacilli, which maintain a pH that prevents pathogens from invading. And actually, it's when a woman suffers from a yeast infection or bacterial vaginosis, it's almost never a foreign bacteria or a foreign microbe that causes those infections. Those infections are actually caused almost all the time by overgrowth of normal components of the vaginal microbiome. When lactobacilli are there, they create this acidic environment that those other microbes don't thrive very well in. And so those other microbes are normally found in the vaginal environment, but they're at low levels. When lactobacilli are removed, the pH rises, and these other normal components of the vaginal environment overgrow and cause all of these problems for the woman. So again, this shows that sometimes diseases are not caused by a pure pathogen, but from an imbalance in microbes that are just very normally found in the human body.